Section 6 of the Complete Works of Tacitus, edited by Thomas Gordon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Complete Works of Tacitus, to which are prefixed political discourses upon that author, edited and translated by Thomas Gordon, with introductory essays by Thomas Gordon. Volume 1. Discourse 5. Of Governments Free and Arbitrary, more especially that of the Caesars, Part 1. Section 1. The Principle of God's appointing and protecting tyrants, an absurdity not believed by the Romans. I do not find that a servitude so beastly and ignominious was borne by the Romans out of principle. Their religion, as vain and superstitious as it was, had never offered such an insult to common sense as to teach them that their deities, as capricious as they thought them, warranted tyranny and sanctified tyrants, that the brutal and bloody Caligula was the beloved and viceregent of Jove, almighty, all-wise, and all-merciful, that the worst of men had a commission from heaven to oppress all men and to destroy the best, that murder, rapine, and misrule were government, and such lawless and bloody robbers were governors divinely appointed, that society had no remedy against devouring lust and the raging sword, which were destroying all the ends of society and society itself. These are absurdities below paganism and all its chimeras. Even the superstition of pagans never broached such blasphemies and indignities to God and man, never propagated doctrines which would have turned men into idiots, destitute of reflection and feeling, nay, into beasts of burden and beasts for sacrifice, turned the deities into devils, human society into a chaos of blood and carcasses, and this earth into a place of torments. It never entered into the heart of a Greek or a Roman, nor into any heart which felt the sentiments of virtue and humanity, that it was unlawful to defend law, a crime to ward against murder, barbarity, and desolation, and an impiety to do the most godlike action which can be done on this side of heaven, that of disarming a tyrant and saving one's country from perishing. It is true that the Romans flattered their tyrants, as tyrants ever will be flattered. But, as the names and appearances of the old government still subsisted, they pretended to believe that none but the old laws were exercised, and by the old laws the emperors still pretended to act. For several generations after the state was enslaved, and even during the reigns of the worst of the Caesars, the Romans expressed high contempt for nations who were avowedly slaves, and for kings who were avowedly arbitrary, and it then continued usual to behold foreign monarchs attending the levee and train of the Roman magistrates and governors of provinces. Nay, they were sometimes denied access, and treated with great scorn. Government is doubtless a sacred thing, and justly claims all reverence and duty, but in the idea of government is implied that of public protection and security, that it is the terror of evil-doers and the encouragement of such as do well. But when what was government ceases, and what is called government is in reality a general oppression, havoc, and spoil, when a power prevails which is swayed by evil-doers to the destruction of all who do well, when law and righteousness are banished, lust and iniquity triumph, property is violently invaded, and lives are wantonly destroyed, is this government too? If it be, I shall be glad to know what is not government. Section 2. The reasonableness of resisting tyrants asserted from the ends of government and the nature of the deity. Opinions the most impious and extravagant, why taught, and how easily swallowed. It is certainly unlawful to resist government, but it is certainly lawful to resist the deviation from government, and to resist what destroys government and men. To resist the abuse of government is to assist government. It is allowed to be just to help our protectors, but it is equally just to oppose our enemies, madmen, and spoilers. Now, what was Nero, what Caligula and Claudius? One a bloody idiot, the other an inhuman madman, the first like the second, and all of them public robbers and butchers. If their course of cruelties and oppression was government, so are plagues, tempests, and inundations. But if their lives and actions were altogether pernicious and detestable, the exterminating of such monsters from amongst men would have been a service to the whole race. Was Tarquin half so black and odious? Yet who has ever blamed his expulsion? Was the insolence and tyranny of Tarquin the ordinance of God? What then was the succeeding government of the people and senate? If this was the ordinance of God too, then every government, good and bad, or rather misgovernment as well as government, public robbery and ruin as well as public security and protection, may be equally said to be his ordinance. And there are ordinances of his that combat one another, like the two angels contending in one of the prophets. But if the tyranny of Tarquin was, and the establishing of the free state was not the ordinance of God, then are not the patrons of this opinion obliged to say, and to maintain this gross and blasphemous absurdity, that the divine being disapproves of good government, equity, and laws, and delights in injustice, cruelty, and confusion, not in the rule of equal justice, but in the ravages of lust and iniquity? To say that all governments, the good and the bad, are alike to him, equally inviolable, is to say that he takes no cognizance of things below, and at this rate there is in his sight no such thing as guilt and innocence. To allege that that government which is best for men is disliked by him, and the rule of lust is preferable to that of laws, is to make him worse than indifferent, the patron of wantonness and oppression, a foe to order and benevolence, fonder of one man's caprice and violence than of the happiness of millions, nay, a professed advocate for iniquity, a professed adversary to all public righteousness. If it be said that he approves not of tyranny himself, and yet would not have it resisted by others, this is nonsense added to profaneness, since what he neither checks nor allows to be checked, he may be said to approve. If I see a man going to commit murder, and by terrible threatening and penalties restrain such as would restrain him, will it not be construed that I chose to have the murder perpetrated? It makes him besides a hard-hearted being, who forbids to remedy the highest human evil, nay, wilfully dooms humankind to the severest misery. I never heard that he has forbid under any penalty the use of medicines against the plague, and I think I have found the reason why I had never heard it. The plague has no treasures nor dignities to recompense flatterers. Had it been worth while to have made such a prohibition a doctrine of religion, that is, had it been pleasing to power, and the way to favour, I doubt not but it would have gained ground, and many followers, as other doctrines equally absurd have done, where the gain and craft of a few have been followed and defended by the superstition and zeal of many. Witness transubstantiation, purgatory, auricular confession, blind obedience under the rod of tyranny, etc. The Turks, out of bigotry to that of predestination, forbear all precautions against the plague, when raging on every side of them. It is impossible to invent a doctrine so monstrous and mischievous, but it will meet with partisans and admirers, provided the inventors have convenient names and habiliments, without which the most illustrious and benevolent truths will hardly pass with a multitude bewitched with the magic of words and superstition. It is impossible for the hearts of men to contrive a principle more absurd and wicked than that of annexing divine and everlasting vengeance to the resisting of the most flagrant mischief which can possibly befall the sons of men. Yet it has found inventors and vouchers. It is plain from this instance, and from 1,000 more, that there is no wickedness of which the hearts of men are not capable, and that the wretchedness of the whole race weighs not so much with them as their own profit and pleasure. It would seem from hence as if we had lived in the dregs and barbarism of time, since to the late age, at least here in Christendom, was reserved the infamy of hatching a monster so horrible that to its birth was sacrificed all sense and humanity, all the considerations, and even the essence of truth, order, and liberty. The advocates for this impious tenet, which represents the great and good God as incensed with men for striving to remove their chains and sorrows, are, by defending tyranny, so much worse than tyrants, as a scheme of barbarity coolly and deliberately contrived or defended is more heinous than particular acts of barbarity committed in the heat and hurry of passion, and as murder is a greater crime than manslaughter. What avail laws and liberty, ever so excellently framed, when they are at the mercy of lawless rage and caprice? If we are forbid by God to defend laws, why do we make them? Is it not unlawful to make what it is unlawful to defend? What else is the end of government but the felicity of men? And why are some raised higher in society than others, but that all may be happy? Has God ever interposed against the establishment of society upon a good foot? If he has not, but wills the good of society and of men, how comes he to interpose against the defence of an establishment which he nowhere forbids, and against that good which he is said to will? What more right had Nero to take away the lives of innocent men than any other assassin? What more title to their fortune than any other robber? What better right to spill their blood than any tiger? And it is unlawful to resist robbers, and assassins, and beasts of prey? Did the Almighty ever say of that beastly tyrant, "Touch not Nero my anointed, nor do his ruffians any harm"? Did Nero's station lessen or abrogate his crimes? What idea does it give of God, the Father of mercies and of men, to represent him screening that enemy to God and man as a person sacred and inviolable, and holding his authority from himself, the merciful and holy Jehovah protecting an inhuman destroyer? What more relation could there be between God and Nero than between God and an earthquake, God and a conflagration or massacre? The very phrase is shocking to the soul. Is such representation likely to make the name and nature of God amiable to men, likely to excite them to love and reverence him? Satan is said to be delighted with the miseries and calamities of men, and to suppose that wicked being concerned for the security of a tyrant, whose office it is to debase and afflict human race, is natural and consistent with his character. But I wish men would not father upon the author of all good such counsels and inclinations as can only suit the father of cruelties and lies. Section 3. The danger of slavish principles to such as trust in them, and the notorious insecurity of lawless might. Neither have tyrants and oppressors been much obliged to this enslaving doctrine, which has generally filled them with false confidence and security. It has always made them worse, seldom safer, and, without doing any good, been the cause of much evil to their poor subjects. The Turks hold it as an article of faith, and it is one worthy of Turkish grossness and barbarity. Yet where has the deposing and murdering of princes been so common as in Turkey? The monarch is told he may do what he pleases. Their religion tells him so. The holy mufti, who explains it, tells him so, and from God he tells him so. But, notwithstanding all these holy authorities, this person so sacred, and guarded with securities human and divine, is often butchered with less form than a common malefactor, and even with the mufti's consent and assistance. Thus it has happened to several in a century. Had not their power been so great, their security would have been greater. An absolute prince is of all others the most insecure. As he proceeds by no rule of law, he can have no rule of safety. He acts by violence, and violence is the only remedy against him. Now violence which is confined to no rule, but as various and unlimited as the passions and devices of men, can never be parried by any certain provision or defence. His acts of cruelty upon particulars, whether done for revenge or prevention, do but alarm other particulars to save themselves by destroying him. Men who apprehend their lives to be in danger will venture anything to preserve them, or if they do more than apprehend and be already become desperate, we know to what lengths despair will push them. Thus Caligula, thus Domitian, and Commodus were slaughtered by those whom they had doomed to slaughter. Nor armies nor guards can prevent the machinations and efforts of a secret enemy. Even amongst his armies and guards such a one may be found, nay, in his household, in his bedchamber, amongst his kindred, nay, amongst his children. When princes act by law in case of hardship upon particulars, there is a remedy to be sought from the law, and when the law, fairly administered, will afford none, they will acquiesce, or, if they blame anything, they will blame the law, but a remedy they will be apt to seek, and, when they suffer not from law, but from mere violence, they will have recourse to violence. Neither can a people be ever so sunk or deadened by oppression, but much provocation, some management, and a skilful leader will find or raise some spirit in them, often enough to accomplish great revolutions. Witness Sicily under the French, Switzerland under the yoke of Austria, and the Low Countries under that of Spain. Nay, the most consummate and professed slaves, those of Turkey, often rouse themselves, and casting their proud rider to the earth, trample him to death. Indeed, slaves enraged are the most dangerous populace, because, having no other resource against oppression, they repel violence with outrage. A little spark often raises a great flame, and a flame soon spreads to a conflagration, where materials are prepared, as they almost eternally are in governments that are absolute, or aiming to be so. The commotions at Paris during the minority of the late king were followed by others all over France, though the whole kingdom had been for a great while before, by the tyranny of the administration, frightened, despairing, and even lethargic. But the resentment and convulsions that followed this false calm had like to have overset the monarchy. Nor can any public calm be certain, or any government secure, where the people are pillaged and oppressed. People that are used like beasts will act like beasts, and be mad and furious when buffeted and starved. Section 4. Princes of little and bad minds, most greedy of power. Princes of large and good minds, choose to rule by law and limitations. It is poor and contemptible ambition in a prince, that of swelling his prerogative and catching at advantages over his people. It is separating himself from the tender relation of a father and protector, a character which constitutes the glory of a king, and assuming that of a foe and an ensnarer. This is what a prince of a great and benevolent spirit will consider, not himself as a lordly tyrant, nor them as his property and slaves, but himself and them under the amiable and engaging ties of magistrate and fellow citizens. Such was the difference between a Queen Elizabeth and a Richard II. How glorious and prosperous the reign of the one, how infamous and unhappy that of the other! What renown accompanies her memory, what scorn his! It is indeed apparent from our history that those of our princes who thirsted most violently after arbitrary rule were chiefly such as were remarkable for poor spirit and small genius, pedants, bigots, the timorous and effeminate. The French historians observe that the worst and weakest of their kings were fondest of dominion, and their best and wisest contented with stinted power and the rule of laws. Louis XI, says Cardinal de Retz, was more crafty than wise. He was in truth a genuine tyrant. He trampled upon the laws of the kingdom and the lives of his subjects, pillaged and oppressed all manner of ways, and followed no counsel but that of his lust and caprice. But What advantage or content, what security or fame did he draw from his exorbitant encroachments and power? No man ever lived under a blacker series of fears and cares and suspicions, or died in greater misery and terrors. And in his life and death and memory he is equally detestable. Louis XIII, a man naturally harmless but silly, was jealous of his authority, purely because he was ignorant about it. But Henry IV, who was born with a soul great and generous, never distrusted the laws, because he trusted in the uprightness of his own designs. Il ne se défie pas de loi, parce qu'il se fie en lui-même, says de Retz. Another French monarch of great name loved and enjoyed unbridled dominion, but had no greatness of mind or genius answerable to the measure of his ambition. He had a sort of stiffness and perseverance, by his flatterers styled fortitude and firmness, but in reality arising from arrogance or obstinacy, qualities found in the weakest woman, and eminently in his mother. In religion he was a bigot, in politics false, suspicious, and timid, in government insolent and oppressive, the property of his mistresses, the pupil of his confessors, the dupe of his ministers, a sore plague to his neighbours, a sorer to his own people, vainly addicted to war without the talents of a warrior, a dishonourable enemy, a faithless ally, and, with small abilities, a great troubler of the world. It was natural to such an imperial wolf as Caligula to delight in power as savage as his own bloody spirit, and to boast that he had an unlimited privilege to do whatever his will or fury suggested. But worthy of the benevolent and humane heart of Trajan were the words by him used to his chief officers when he presented them with the sword. "This sword, this badge of authority, you hold from me, but turn it, if I deserve it, against me." Now, did the challenging and exercise of this monstrous power secure Caligula, or did the disavowing of it lessen the security of Trajan? Quite otherwise. The former was abhorred and assassinated as a tyrant, the latter was adored living, and died lamented as a public father and guardian. Trajan knew no other purpose of imperial prerogative but that of protecting the people, nor indeed is there any other use of emperors and prerogatives upon earth. Cardinal de Retz says that with all the arguments and pains he could use, he could never bring the Queen Regent to understand the meaning of these words, the public. She thought that to consult the interest of the people was to be a republican, and had no notion that the government of a prince was anything else but royal will and authority, rampant and without bounds. Was it any wonder that the people of France gasped under oppressions and taxes, when the government was swayed by such a woman, herself blindly governed by Mazarin, a public thief, if ever there was any, one convicted to have stolen from the finances 9 millions in a few years, one who spent his younger years in low rogueries, who had no maxims of rule but such as were adapted to the severest tyranny in Italy, that of the Pope, and one who, in the highest post of first minister, could never help showing the base spirit of a little sharper. Le vilain car parfois toujours au travers, says de Retz. The Duke of Orléans called him un scélérat, et ministre incapable et abhorré du genre humain, un menteur fieffé. Section 5. The wisdom and safety of ruling by standing laws, to prince and people. It was a fine answer of Theopompus, king of Lacedaemon, to his wife, who reproached him that he would leave the kingship diminished to his sons by creating the ephori. "Yes," says he, "I shall leave it smaller, but I shall leave it more permanent." Valerius Maximus explains this by a very just reflection. Theopompus's reason was full of pertinency and force, for in reality the authority which bounds itself and offers no injuries is exposed to none. The king, therefore, by restraining royalty within the just limits of laws, did as much endear it to the affections of his countrymen as he pruned it of all licentiousness and terrors. It is as rare for a prince limited by laws and content with his power to reign in sorrow, or to die tragically, as it is uncommon for those who have no bounds set them, or will suffer none, to escape a miserable reign and unbloody end. The power of the Roman kings was, from the first establishment, very short. They had no negative voice in the Senate, and could neither make war nor peace. What Tacitus says of Romulus can only mean his administering justice as the chief magistrate between man and man, or perhaps his encroachments upon the Senate towards his latter end, for which, it is thought, he paid dear. Where the government is arbitrary and severe, the oppressed people will be apt to think that no change can make their condition worse, and therefore will be ready to wish for any, nay, to risk a civil war, risk fresh evils and calamities, to get rid of the present, and to be revenged on their oppressor. Such was the temper of the Romans upon the revolt of Sacrovir. They even rejoiced in it, and, in hatred to Tiberius, wished success to the public enemy. People will be quiet and patient under burdens, however heavy, which law lays on, for they suppose that laws are founded upon reason and necessity. But impositions the most reasonable will be apt to appear unreasonable and tyrannical where they proceed from the will of one. Mere will is supposed to act without reason, and to be only the effect of wantonness. Hence the acquiescence of a free people, however taxed, and from their acquiescence the safety of their governors. Hence, too, the industry and wealth, and consequently the peaceableness of the country. For industry and wealth are things exceeding quiet and tame, and only aim at securing themselves, whereas idleness and indigence are uneasy, tumultuous, and desperate. Besides, he who pays 20 shillings in a free government, and pays it cheerfully, would not, perhaps, were the government changed, pay willingly 10, nay, perhaps be unable to pay it, though by the change no new taxes were added. While the law requires it, he will imagine that no more than enough is required, and as the same law leaves him all the rest to himself, he will be industrious to acquire more, and as much as he can. But when the quantity of his tax depends on the caprice or avarice of one, when the more he is worth, the more he will be taxed, or even fancies that he will grow idle, discontented, and desponding, and rather live poor and lazy than labour to make his tax-master rich. Not to mention the furious monarchies of the East, destructive of all diligence and arts. The Comte de Boulainvilliers, in his Élat de France, says that in some provinces in France the soil is left uncultivated, and several trades and professions are disused, because the labour of the husbandman and the skill and application of the artist are rendered abortive by rigorous impositions. They choose rather to starve in idleness than to work and starve. Section 6. The condition of free states, how preferable to that of such as are not free. No arbitrary prince upon earth could have raised from the states of Holland the 5th part of what they have, as a free state paid to their own magistrates, nor could have found whence to have raised it. I will venture to say the same of England. Under a monarchy of the late King James's model, was it possible to have supported 2 wars so long and consuming as the 2 last, or to have raised sums so immense to carry them on? It would be madness to assert it. By this time numbers of our people would have been driven from their country, much of our soil been waste, many of our manufactures laid aside, our trade sunk, our wealth fled, and the condition of England have resembled that of France, as well as our government theirs, and for the same reason. It is in vain boasted of the house of Medici that in a long course of years they had laid no new tax upon a country where their power was absolute, since the cities and territories under their sovereignty are by it reduced from great wealth and populousness to such miserable desolation and poverty that it is downright oppression to oblige them to pay any considerable part of the old, much more all. To reason from experience and examples is the best reasoning. Compare any free state with any other that is not free. Compare the former and present condition of any state formerly free, or once enslaved and now free. Compare England with France, Holland with Denmark, or the 7 provinces under the states with the same 7 provinces under Philip II. You will find in these and every other instance that happiness and wretchedness are the exact tallies to liberty and bondage. Florence was a commonwealth ill-framed at first, and consequently subject to frequent convulsions, factions, parties, and subdivision of parties. Yet, by the mere blessing and vigour of liberty, she flourished in people, riches, and arms, till, with her liberty, she lost all spirit and prosperity, and became languishing, little and contemptible, under a small prince with a great name. She has long been cured of all her former frolics and tumults by an effectual remedy, servitude, and beggary the child of servitude, and by depopulation the offspring of both. All arguments for absolute power are confuted by facts. No country governed by mere will was ever governed well. Passion governs the will becomes the measure of right and wrong and of all things, and caprice the balance of the will. And I know not but it may be maintained that a free state, the worst constituted, as was that of Florence, is, with all its disorders, factions, and tumults, preferable to any absolute monarchy, however calm. Section 7. The misery and insecurity of the Caesars from their overgrown power. These emperors of Rome, who had sacrificed their country and all things to their supreme power, found little ease and security from it being supreme. From Caesar the dictator, who had sacrificed public liberty, and was himself sacrificed to Hermanes, till Charlemagne, above 30 of them were murdered, and 4 of them murdered themselves. The soldiery were their masters, and upon every peak put them to death. If the prince was chosen by the Senate, this was reason enough for shedding his blood by the armies, or if the armies chose him, this choice of their own never proved an obstacle against shedding it. It was the soldiers that dispatched the Emperor Pertinax, after he had been forced to accept the empire. These lofty sovereigns, having trodden under foot the Senate, people, and laws, the best supports of legitimate power, held their sceptre and their lives upon the courtesy of their masters the soldiers. He who swayed the universe was a slave to his own mercenaries. Though Augustus had reigned so long, and so thoroughly enfeebled or extinguished the maxims of liberty, and introduced and settled those of monarchy, Tiberius, his immediate successor, thought himself so little safe that he lived in perpetual vassalage to his own fears. By making all men slaves, he could not make himself free, and was only the most overgrown and gaudy slave in the empire, so much do princes gain by being above law. They who will be content with no terms of reigning, but such as make all men fear them, will find reasons to fear all men. Tiberius did so, and the many sacrifices which he made to his fear, far from lessening, did but increase it, as such sacrifices did but multiply enemies and terrors. First he dreaded Agrippa Postumus, and murdered him. But the murder ensured not his repose even from that quarter, for a slave of that prince personated his master, and alarmed Tiberius more than Agrippa had done. He dreaded Germanicus, and when that excellent person was dead, by no fair means it was supposed, he dreaded Agrippina his wife, and her little children, and when by all manner of treachery and cruelty he had oppressed them, he was seized with new dread from Sejanus, the greatest and justest of all. Nor ceased his dread after the execution of Sejanus, insomuch that he commanded a general massacre of all his family, friends, and adherents. Next, his fears still continuing, he doomed to the most barbarous death his own grandsons by Germanicus, for their being already under miserable imprisonment and exile did not suffice. And when the family of Germanicus was destroyed, he had remaining fears from the friends and dependents of that house. These were the next objects of his vengeance, which he executed fiercely. Nor small was the terror which he entertained of his own mother, and when she was gone, he let loose his rage upon the favourites and adherents of his mother. Now, after all these precautions, so many and so bloody, did his suspicions abate? No, they were rather whetted and inflamed. Of the great lords of the Senate he was under perpetual apprehensions, and making daily victims. Their wealth and race, nay, their poverty, names, and qualities frightened him. He feared friends and enemies, those who advised him in council, Those who diverted him at his leisure hours, his confidants, counsellors, and bottle companions, were all martyrs to his jealousy and fury. He was so afraid of considerable men, or giving them employments which made them so, that some who were appointed governors of provinces were never permitted to go thither, and great provinces for a course of years left destitute of their governors. And though he dreaded stirs and innovations above all things, yet he suffered the loss and devastation of provinces, the insults and invasion of enemies, rather than trust any one with the power of avenging the state and repulsing the public foe. Thus he left Armenia to be seized by the Parthians, Moesia by the Dacians and other barbarians, and both the Gauls to be ravaged by the Germans, says Suetonius. End of Discourse 5, Part 1.